So why don't we start with introductions? And I'll start with Brendan.
My name is Brendan O'Neill. I'm an Assistant Attorney General with the Attorney General's Office. I'm not a member of the Recovery Council.
Okay, Grayson.
My name is Grayson Havens. I am also with the Attorney General's Office and not a member of council.
Okay. Katrina.
I'm Katrina Bonish. I'm also with the Attorney General's Office.
Okay, thank you. Betsy.
Betsy Fitzgerald, representing the litigating subdivisions.
Tess.
Hi everyone, I'm Tess Parks, and on the council, I represent folks with lived experience of substance use disorder.
Good. Maggie.
Hey everyone, I'm Maggie. I guess almost afternoon. I represent litigating subdivisions. I also am having IT issues today, so I can't turn my camera off. So I don't know if we have to vote on anything. That might be an issue, but I'm trying to put my camera on.
Okay.
Back to you, Paul.
I'm Paul Vinsel. I'm the chair of the governance committee. I'm a representative from the attorney. I was nominated by the Attorney General's office. So we have, I'm wondering, Elizabeth, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sorry, it wouldn't let me sign in. I am Elizabeth Fortier, and I am the coordinator for the Maine Recovery Council.
So many IT problems today.
Friday.
That's right. Would anyone be willing to take notes and write up minutes of this meeting? There's a kitty.
Yeah, I'll turn my screen off as long as that keeps happening.
Paul, I can take notes if you want.
That would be great, Maggie. I'd appreciate it. So we have four things on the agenda today. First is to discuss the need for a MRC clerk. Number two is begin planning for the public forum. And Pat had an interesting suggestion with that. Let me turn off my dehumidifier just a minute. And then to begin planning for needs assessment. And number four, to discuss how the MRC can use executive sessions when discussing sensitive issues so we'll get into that. Let's start with the MRC clerk. So Grayson, if you could put up the bylaws for me, can you share that? And we're just going, it's early on in section 1.3. Up. There we go. So the only thing I could find in the bylaws was section 1.3, the clerk of the council will be an attorney or employee of the Maine Attorney General's office. The person designated as the clerk may be changed from time to time by the chair of the council. Thank you, Grayson. You can stop sharing. Currently, Grayson works for the Attorney General's office, and he is acting as our clerk. But Brendan, you've indicated that you think that the Recovery Council should have their own clerk. Would that clerk be kind of embedded in the Attorney General's office?
No, I think the clerk for the council, could be it could be, any of the council members. I think it also could be, the executive director, whether it could be the coordinator, I can look into. I'm trying to pull up the statute as we speak that directs the board to have a clerk. And
Was that
there's
in the
also a clerk's manual that is circulated by the Secretary of State's office that I can make available.
Was that in the memorandum of understanding?
No, it's part of the statute that creates the
right.
or doesn't create, but part of the statute that codifies the Recovery Council.
Okay.
It's the type of committee that the council is, under Maine law, requires there to be a clerk.
Grayson, are you able to share kind of what you feel the duties of the clerk are?
Yeah, absolutely. So the role of the clerk is mostly two things. Reporting on the meetings of the council and reporting on the expenditures of the council. The way that I do it and the way that Haley did it before me, for remote meetings, we just input the location, which is just Zoom, and then how many members attended. You don't have to do it by name, just a number. And then for the expenditures, we add those on to the monthly in-person meetings and report based on the reconciliation lists that come out from the Attorney General's office that the treasurer uses to make that, not the budget spreadsheet, but the other one, the one that was looked at the last meeting, updated with the same information. And then at the end of the year, usually in December, when the last reconciliation comes out, an annual report is due where the Secretary of State's office their website does most of this work for you, but it compiles all of that meeting information that you've put in throughout the year. And you just write up a little blurb about what the council did that year and submit it to the Secretary of State.
And when you report the meetings of the council and the expenditures, who do you report that to?
The Secretary of State, it's right on their website. There's a little login that we may have to look into getting changed because right now it has Brendan listed as the clerk. And it's his login information, so we may need to change that if the clerk does become somebody on the council, but you get a username and a password and you log in through there, and then you just submit all the information directly in that website on that form.
Okay.
And for context, the reason it's me is because when I did the work of setting up the council, in order to just have somebody in place so the council could move forward. I made myself the clerk, figuring that there were administrative tasks that we could take care of internally in the AG's office until the council sorted itself out about how it was going to run itself.
Okay.
And let me give you the statutory citation for the clerk requirement, which provides a little bit more information about the duties of the clerk as well. I'm just going to leave my video off because cats keep happening. I apologize.
I like the cats.
All right, fine. Title 5, Section 12005-A of Maine's statutes. I don't have my Zoom hooked up to my office computer right now, so I can't just drop that link in the chat. Grayson, I wonder if you could, I'm going to email that statute to you. I wonder if you could just drop it into the Zoom chat.
Yeah.
And then I will also email to the group the Secretary of State's clerk manual.
Brendan, I hate to ask you questions while you're trying to do something.
I don't know. It's fine.
Given the bylaw section 1.3 stating that it will be an attorney or an employee of the Attorney General's office, Will we need to change that section, that bylaws?
Yes, I'm not, in reviewing the statute, I don't see, anything in the statutory provision that requires that is like particularly, sort of legal responsibilities. So I don't think it needs to be an attorney.
Okay.
That's fine. Then. 605A. The when Grayson's able to circulate the link, you'll see that the requirement in the statute, says that every board listed in this chapter, which the council is required to appoint a clerk of the board who is responsible for submitting reports to the Secretary of State as required by the chapter. The clerk shall submit an annual report to the Secretary of State, no later than December 31st of each calendar year, and must include information required by this statute, and whatever else the Secretary of State's office determines necessary to fulfill the purposes of this chapter.
Could we just use that language to change the bylaws and just put that language in?
Certainly. The statute goes on to describe the information that has to be included, but there's, a way to, draft around that in creating a provision for the bylaws.
Okay, great.
And, it's once you have a chance to review the administrative responsibilities of the report, um, you know, um, the council can decide who sort of the right kind of person associated with the council is that would be, have the responsibility of doing this report. It could be that, the right person is the executive director, but that person delegates to the coordinator. It could be that it's the chair and that person delegates to the executive director, the responsibility, the actual logistics of doing the work. In our case, currently right now, I'm technically the clerk, but I've asked Grayson to help out with, putting together the reports and filing the reports. So that dynamic can happen. I think the point here is that there's no reason this needs to be done by the Attorney General's office. I think it's more appropriately done by the council so that it can be in control of its own reporting.
Okay, great. So,
And I will flag that, and again, we'll circulate the um, um, the manual. But I do think that one thing to pay attention to is any sort of penalties that result from failure to submit the report. I will say the Secretary of State's office is fantastic about saying, hey, here the deadline's coming up, or we haven't received a report, and giving different bodies like plenty of time to cure a lack of filing or things like that.
so what I can do is when I get the statutory requirements in the manual, I could draft a change to the bylaws, and we could vote on that the next governance committee meeting, and then present it to the Recovery Council. Would that be an okay timeline, Brendan?
I think that makes sense to me. That's fine.
Okay.
I don't think it's particularly, it's not urgent. We have found that it's important to keep up with the stuff that's going to be in the report, because you don't want to get to, November 30th and realize you've got this report to do and you have to compile all the expenses for the council's activities. This council meets a lot, and all the things the council did. So there is some, very regular ongoing work that needs to be done. But the report itself isn't due until the end of the year.
Okay, great.
Paul, when you draft that bylaw change, will you be sure to send that to me or Elizabeth so we can include it with the notice?
Oh, I will definitely want that. And I'll send it to Brendan because I've never really written legal stuff.
I've said this
Okay.
already. The cats keep wandering past the picture. These are new in our life, and I'm still figuring out how to work from home and how to deal with them. So I apologize for the constant interference.
Oh, I think it's wonderful.
Okay.
Okay, second thing on the agenda is planning the public forum. So the last public forum we had was in December, and it has typically been the December meeting. Is that right, Betsy? That the last 2 years have been the December meeting? So looking at the calendar, December meeting will be December 12th. Oh, no, I'm sorry, that's June. Okay, it'll be December 11th. Now, in the past, we've had it in the morning and lasting all day. That's difficult for me because in the mornings on the second Tuesday, I have a osteopathic licensing board meeting. I missed it last year for the public forum, and there was quite a bit of stuff I missed. So I don't think I would be willing to miss it this time. But we certainly could have it, and I could miss it. That would be fine. What do people think on that?
Well, if you change kind of the schedule, I mean, I don't see any reason why you can't. Certainly this far in advance.
I just wouldn't want to change it to something that's not good for the majority of the people just to satisfy my schedule.
Welcome to the world. What would work for your schedule, Paul?
Having it on that Thursday in the afternoon.
Okay,
Usually the licensing board meeting gets out about 11:30, and I race down the hill to the recovery council.
okay.
So afternoon would work fine.
We meet in the afternoon anyway, usually, don't we?
Right. We meet in the afternoon, though. The public forum has been a little bit longer in that I think the first one lasted really all day, as I remember.
I believe it did.
Yeah. I don't think the second one did last quite as long.
No, it did not.
So
This is Holly. Would we need a snow date? I can't imagine saying that word this week, but
What?
the backup.
yes, we probably should have a snow date.
It feels funny talking about that, but
Yeah.
just good planning, both with the facility and us. Even if it's like the 11th or I don't even have the calendar up, the 11th or the 13th or something like that,
Well, the 11th is a Thursday.
Yeah.
I'm just
The
gonna,
13th is a Saturday, so I suspect that might not be an option.
all I know is that the legislature will not be in December and I will be there. How about that? I mean, it could be as easily as the 12th, right? The 11th or the 12th.
Yeah,
I mean, it's,
Yeah, we could have the snow date the 12th.
yeah, because even if we had a snowstorm, we'd likely be out of it by the 12th.
Yeah, they're pretty good at clearing the roads here. Maggie, you have a
So
comment.
that's just my,
I was just checking, like, I remember I've only been to one of these, and when we did have quite a few people coming in for public comment who were coming in from 3 or 4 hours away. And so I do wonder if we could still, even if it's not on, like if we move the day off of a Thursday, so that way you can still make your meeting, but if we can still have it start relatively mid-morning, so that way we account for the fact that they have to transit back after public comment, and they're probably going to want to be listening to the whole meeting.
Okay. And Tess?
Yeah, just to piggyback off that, when we've talked about this in the past, I think I brought up and maybe some others just how transportation and location can be such a barrier for so many people. And I'm wondering if we have the ability to have a hybrid option where folks could testify via Zoom, if that would work out in terms of technology. And then if there's anything in the bylaws that would prohibit that, I'm assuming not, but I really feel strongly that we should explore that option to give people the opportunity to testify if they want.
how about something that started on the 10th? That we open the meeting on the 10th and do the public forum and then pause and come back the following day for the regular meeting on Thursday, the 11th. And you could have starting maybe at 12, you could have another public forum period before the meeting started at 1:30.
I like that option. I think it provides the most flexibility, which is what we were trying to drive towards with tests, if I'm getting you correct, and lowering as many barriers as possible. And that allows for some of the time burdens on physically being present together to be reduced.
So
So you could do Zoom on the 11th. On the 10th, do Zoom on the 10th. From, 1 to 3 or 1 to 4. And then pause. And start again at noon on the 11th to 1:30, and then the meeting at 1:30.
So we could have, so I get this right, and I think that sounds really interesting. So the meeting on Wednesday would be all done by Zoom.
Yes,
So people wouldn't have to transport in, but they could give testimony.
correct.
And that would be start at noon.
Well, I just was throwing out some times, but
Yep.
I mean, Maggie's point is well taken that if people are traveling, but if they're not traveling, then, noon or 11,
Yeah, I think
a number. I
I
don't,
think that's great. And then the Recovery Council meeting, the following day, the normal meeting would occur, but we would start at noon so that we have an hour and a half there if people want to give in-person testimony.
that's kind of where I was headed, yes.
Oh, I think that sounds really neat. That would, Grayson, would we be able to get the building Thursday at noon?
For the forum or for the council meeting?
For both.
And
So we'd have the forum from noon to 1:30,
Okay.
and then we'd have our regular council meeting.
Yeah, I would, I'd have to check because I haven't like looked into what their availability is. But I could check, especially if it's this far in advance. And if UMA isn't available, I'm sure we could find another space.
Well, what I'm wondering is, could we do it right in the DHHS building?
I will have to get back to you on that. I think there is a reason why it hasn't been held there in the past. I'm just not exactly sure why. It might be because there's not enough room for a large amount of guests, would be my assumption, but I can confirm and let you know.
Okay. Well, if we had it at Maine Augusta, you know, and then we could just have our meeting there. I think that sounds like a really great idea to have an online meeting on Wednesday and have online testimony, and then have our regular meeting with in-person testimony for an hour and a half before. So we can present that to, oh, Tess, go ahead.
Just one question. So if, say hypothetically, the in-person option does end up being popular, and maybe we end up with more than an hour and a half, will we be able to accommodate and hear from everyone that has made it, even if it means sacrificing some of our meeting time?
You know, the past 2 Decembers, we just haven't had a meeting. We've just had the public forum. I think that's right, Betsy, is it?
Yes, I think when we did the public forum, yeah, but I was just thinking about Tessa's question. I think you can tell at the beginning of the forum how many people you're gonna have testify. And if you have a mob, then you say, you know, sorry, folks, but you've got 3 minutes. We've done that before. So, I just would, you know, I think some of it is we just have to adjust to, quite frankly, whoever comes through the door.
Yeah.
They
and-
would have had the day before to testify online with, you know, and so there is that, there would have been that option ahead of time.
I think the Recovery Council could be relatively flexible about their meeting time also on that Thursday. You know,
Oh, absolutely.
if 100 people showed up and wanted to all testify in person, you know, I think we would all want to accommodate them.
Yeah, because I'm just thinking if or when there's more federal cuts, who knows what our public forum might look like in terms of people wanting to share the needs that are coming up in their communities.
Point taken.
Brendan, do you know if there's anything that would, any legal thing that would interfere with us having part of the public forum by Zoom?
I'll look into that. My initial instinct is I don't think so, but I'll look at the remote meeting policy and FOA.
So I'll present this.
For what it's worth, part of the answer, Paul, is, you know, section 4.1 of the bylaws, the last sentence, you know, talks about the annual meeting. You know, that it provides that the annual meeting shall be open to the public, which you can do over Zoom, and shall be held at such time and in such place that members of the public may reasonably attend if they wish. Which is sort of what we do with council meetings now, where we say, you know, it's going to be in this location. Here's a Zoom link to participate remotely. but I'll look into it further.
Okay. The other thing, Pat had sent me an email, which I thought was really interesting. And she suggested, or wanted to, yeah, she suggested that during the public forum, if we wanted to invite some of the organizations that received grants from the MRC to set up tables to kind of showcase the work that they're doing with MRC funding. I thought that was a really neat idea. It might be hard to do if we have, we would have to do that at the in-person meeting time. Yes, Maggie.
I think it would be interesting to clarify what our intended goal would be with that. I can see many benefits emerging from it, but also it's a really heavy burden on folks to come in and present that and prepare that kind of information for dissemination. It's also, unless it's facilitated, may not result in the like intended goal that we have. And so I think right now, the way that the annual meeting seems to be, based off of exactly my one experience, so jump in and clarify if I'm wrong, but it was a very limited audience. It was really people who wanted to influence or share their feedback on how the opioid settlement funds were being used by the MRC, and then the members themselves. And so if we are inviting people to showcase their impact, I would be curious what our audience for that impact discussion is. Are we trying to influence the broader community to showcase how great this is? If so, they're not in the room right now. If we're trying to build linkages between those different grant recipients, I think that learning space is really important, but it's probably something that needs more time than a public meeting and facilitation by the executive director to really build out some of those relationships and connections so that there's more cross-learning going through with the grantees. And so I just want to clarify our objective in that and then make sure we're matching the package to achieve that objective if that's the route that we go.
Okay, those are good points, Maggie. What I will do, what I'll plan is at the next MRC meeting, I will present our ideas for the public forum for the hybrid model and see what the council members say. Any other comments on that? Okay, number 3 is begin planning for the needs assessment. Grayson, could you put up the bylaws again? And I'm looking at section 2.2. Okay, so it says in section 2.2 of our bylaws, under assessment of needs, in order to determine the best use of the assets of the MRC, the council shall complete a statewide opioid abatement needs assessment no less frequently than every 2 years, incorporating where appropriate existing assessments that were performed within the last 2 years. The council shall consult with stakeholders and the public on the methodology, findings, and conclusions of any needs assessment. I've always found this to be really, thank you, Grayson, you can stop sharing that. I've always found this to be really difficult. Grayson will show soon the Maine opioid strategic action plan that from 2023 to 2025, and it's a 32-page document. And certainly the Maine Recovery Council, I don't think has the time or expertise to do any further, any needs assessment other than what the state has already done. I think what we should do is use the state's strategic action plan. What are people's thoughts on this? Brendan, Grayson, do you want to put that up? Share that? So this is a 32-page document. I know I did read it when it first came out. And this is for 2023, 2025. I think this would, and correct me if I'm wrong, Brendan, would this meet the requirement of a action plan or a needs assessment done by another state organization within the last 2 years?
I think it's for the council to determine whether any given plan is effectively an assessment of the state's needs. And it doesn't have to be this one. It could be, multiple different such plans or assessments. So I think it's really for the council to decide whether this, constitutes an assessment of the state's needs, or whether the council wants to look at additional, assessments.
Grayson, you can stop sharing now. I just don't know how a needs assessment could be very, could be thorough, where you take each county and say, what are the needs here? And you would have to interview, the public, you would have to interview all the stakeholders for each county and each area to really get a proper needs assessment. I think that's way beyond the scope of what the Recovery Council can do. So I don't really understand this idea of the needs assessment that we have in the bylaws. And maybe I'm thinking of it wrong. So I'd love to hear other people's thoughts on that.
And not having been here at the beginning, but if we could do a retrospective look back, was the plan to have the council, I don't want to say mimic, but sort of reflect the same goal areas as the state's strategic plan? I mean, it would seem to me that they would somehow comport, somehow there would be a nexus between the two. Or am I really getting this wrong?
I can speak to that a little bit. I think, and this is from bylaws that were drafted quite a long time ago, and I'm not sure my memory is clear about it, but looking at the MOU that created the council, the MOU directs the council, and it doesn't provide much more detail than this, to direct the disbursement of recovery funds for recovery purposes on a statewide basis for the uses allowed by the MOU. And there's further discussion down below in that part of the MOU about needing to collaborate, with other, entities throughout the state, to facilitate collaboration among the state subdivisions, and other stakeholders. That's about sharing data, outcome strategies, and other relevant information related to abating the opioid crisis in Maine. And I think my recollection is this provision is linked to the one ahead of it, section 2.1, which describes the council's, work, of supplementing and not supplanting directly or indirectly the activities of federal, state, and local governments, and so on. and goes into a little bit more detail um, along the lines of what I talked about from the MOU. And so I think it probably originated from the idea of, if the council is going to, if the council's work is to figure out how to direct these funds on a statewide basis, it needs to have an understanding of what the needs are on a statewide basis. And there may be circumstances where, a governor's office or, other parts of the state are not doing a needs assessment. But to the extent that this 50% pot of the settlement funds are meant to be, distributed statewide, that the council, in order to figure out how to do that, should conduct some kind of assessment of what the needs are statewide.
Does
I ask-
anyone
Can I
with,
ask another clarified question about that? Are there any resources within the council, financial resources to contract with somebody to actually lead that process? Or is it the expectation is that that's done internally through existing resources of council members?
The council, that would be, an authorized, or that would be, an approved, that would be a, use of the council's funds consistent with the approved uses.
Okay. Thank you.
is there anyone here with more public health knowledge than me that can tell me kind of how you would go about doing a needs assessment?
I'm happy to throw in. I think you're right, Paul. To do this in a robust way would be an incredibly large undertaking, and probably a significant resource in terms of the amount of finances we'd have to plug into it. I do think there are a considerable number of secondary resources that are existing right now that could potentially fulfill this function. So even I would imagine the Portland space maybe has more of these than some of the other areas. But for example, in Portland, we've got a county-wide analysis of the circumstance and priorities that has gone about it in a methodologically sound way that echoes what the spirit of this was, talking to people with lived experience, talking to providers, talking to local municipalities and things like that. And so I think it would be a shame to recreate the wheel on some of this. So maybe an appropriate starting place is just a quick scan of what is already out there, and then an analysis of are these gaps so large that we need to supplant them? And also maybe we can narrow the scope of our intent to not just to a little bit more narrow of what is MRC's role in this, as opposed to just a general analysis of the needs of the state. I think that's beyond what we can do, and might be more helpful for us to keep it much more narrow to really mapping almost the funding gaps in some of those priority needs areas that have already been identified. So all that to recap, I think a starting place is to do a needs assess, basically document analysis, and then from there come back with recommendations on what would be needed to either provide a summary of those documents that would meet the need of this clause, or fill the gap to be able to get there. And that, in principle, could be the work of the executive director in partnership with all of us who may have familiarity with some of these resources that are out there and reports that are out there.
So what I hear you saying is we could pull from existing reports where they exist and then use that and then frame almost like a second part of that would be to frame an additional needs assessment if we didn't have all that data.
Exactly. And the more we could even narrow this down further, I think the better it would be in providing direction. Because largely every 2 years, we wouldn't see huge changes in the landscape. We'd see incremental changes in the landscape. And so in principle, if we got a decent lay of the land for this initial one. And then we can focus on particular changes that we're intending to see as the MRC based off of where we're funding and things like that. And then tie in our reporting mechanisms that we're building out right now for our grantees that could help build us a system that's more specific to what the MRC is delivering in this needs space.
That was,
Maggie, all that sounds right to me. And I look at the last sentence of that provision in the bylaws. You know, the council shall consult with stakeholders and the public on the methodology, findings, and conclusions of any needs assessment. And it could be that you know, as part of the council's, you know, public transparency role with the opioid crisis in Maine, you know, it could make available to the public, you know, it could, you know, gather those assessments that you're referring to, you know, or summaries or, you know, whatever other documentation, make them available to the public on the council's website or otherwise, and say, you know, this is what we have found as evidence of, you know, what the needs are in Maine of the opioid crisis, and, you know, invite, you know, or not, you know, the public to, you know, weigh in on you know, any gaps, or, you know, whether there's anything further needed. But, you know, the council could take the position of, here's our library of, you know, current needs assessments. They, you know, based on whenever, here's, you know, people can figure out the methodology and whether they're satisfied with them. And the council can determine whether that, you know, is what the council is going to rely on to conduct its work in addition to the reporting of its own grants. And the council can also look to what other states are doing on that front, you know, in terms of determining the needs that they as the council as an entity is meant to address. I definitely think and agree with the idea that the public, you know, decision makers in the state and interested parties generally are probably going to be more interested in the council using its funding on addressing the need, than on, you know, lots of studies and analysis, you know. But it, at least for me as a layperson, kind of begs the question of, how do you know you're addressing the need without identifying what the need is?
And
I
you're,
really agree. Oh, sorry.
well, go ahead.
I really agree with that, Brendan, around like, where's the best use of our time and effort and funding? Is it in these assessments or in delivering on those gaps? And I think that's why part of this has to be tied into the progress we're making right now on analyzing impact with our existing funds, because they'll go hand in hand. We've already in some ways identified our priorities based off of need. And so we're kind of jumping ahead in the sense that we've picked those priorities already. We're at the stage where we said go and inserted resources into those priorities. And now we need to see how we're addressing that gap. Are we actually reducing it in those priority areas, as opposed to kind of starting at scratch? And so making sure that this conversation around the needs assessment happens in a way that builds on the work that we're doing around building out our monitoring system.
And Grayson had reminded me that in the council's prior you know, iteration, the, you know, the council retained an expert, Dr. Kim Johnson, to, you know, do sort of a scan of needs assessments at that time. I think it was in the first year of the council,
Yes.
and to, you know, try to help the council target what it wanted to accomplish. You know, she produced materials for the council, and attempted to facilitate some discussion at the council level of, you know, what its goals might be in its first and second years. And I think Grayson either has or is going to do some work to make those materials available. And it could be that the council may want to revisit this issue with Dr. Johnson.
So that's exactly the question I was gonna, I used to work with Kim when she was the director of OSA in Maine. So it may be less expensive to ask her to do an update to the last existing assessment she did, since she already has the template, and just to update based on the information we can provide to her of the work that's been done. She may be able to provide a very less expensive, but yet thorough update.
I think that's a great idea.
I would concur.
You're not going back to the beginning and reinventing the whole thing, which you would with a new person if she were willing to do an update.
I wonder if she'd be willing to do an update.
We won't
Always
know.
ask.
Yeah. Well, I'll bring that up to the, we'll bring this up again to the council in July's meeting. And I think that would be a great recommendation for us. Any other comments on the needs assessment? So let's go on to number 4 of our agenda, and that's discuss how MRC can use the executive session when discussing sensitive issues. Brendan, were you at the last Recovery Council meeting?
That's a great question, Paul.
I don't think you were.
I've been out of the office a fair bit the last last several weeks.
But one of the things that we did was the Recovery Council approved our recommendation to change the bylaws so that on the section of go
I just
ahead,
wanted to
Grayson.
note that the vote hasn't happened yet because the change wasn't included in the notice.
I'm sorry, Grayson.
I just wanted to note that that bylaw change wasn't voted on at the meeting because it wasn't included in the notice.
He's correct.
In the notes of the
In the notice.
In the notice of the meeting.
oh, okay. So what do
So
we have to
be
do?
on this upcoming agenda.
It'll be on this upcoming agenda. Okay. Thank you, Grayson, for
And Paul, that's in section 8.1 of the bylaws.
okay. What came of that, Brendan, of that discussion was that there was a lot of thought of when we were doing the grant evaluations after they had all been scored and everything, and we were deciding finally who was going to get funding, and we did that in a public meeting, and a lot of the grant application, the people who put in grant applications did not like that. They felt it was, they were hurt by some of the things people said. And we were, saying, well, these people deserve it and these people don't, or, basically, we weren't saying it that quite like that, but I think some people were insulted. And so the question was, how much of that decision-making can be done in executive session? So when I looked at the FOA statute, Grayson, can you put up the FOA statutes I sent? So if you go down, it says it's the FOA, it really specifically says in FOA what matters can be conducted in executive session. And in none of those does it talk about grant applications or grant decisions or deciding, where to spend money. And I've read it like 2 or 3 times and I can't really find anything in there that allows that. However, when we look at our bylaws, in bylaws, section 4.10. Grayson, can you put that up? So in 4.1, so 4.10, yeah, not 4.10, 4.10. Here it states for executive session, we can in in the middle of it, it says any matter in which a person or entity other than the council has a recognized privacy concern, including but not limited to discussions of grant proposals pending approval or rejection. So it looks like by our bylaws, we could do that in executive session, though it's not clear to me that that follows the FOA statute. So Brendan, I wanted your thoughts on that. And Grayson, you
Oh,
can.
you are correct. The issue is the bylaws. I wrote the bylaws well before, we had done any sort of research into what the council's grant making authority was. And these bylaws were crafted using as a model, the bylaws of the Maine Health Access Foundation. So that's a private foundation, and my best recollection several years later is that that those bylaws perhaps included provision saying, to the extent we're making grants to people, we can discuss privately the matters relating to those grants. And as I maybe Tess, maybe Maggie can, or Betsy can speak to this better than I can. My understanding, when somebody's applying for a grant from DHHS, that there are certain parts of the RFP process that are confidential. I'm not an expert on the state's RFP process, but it's my belief that certain parts of that RFP process are able to be confidential. And what's happening here is that in order for something to be confidential, like in the state's RFP process, it has to be permitted to be confidential under the state's Freedom of Access Act. So there has to be in the statute that applies to the RFP process, there has to be a provision in that explicitly provides, as decided by the legislature, that part of that process can be confidential and therefore exempt from FOA. FOA generally says things have to be made publicly available, except to the extent that they're designated to be confidential, in another statute. So long story short, if you're applying for, a grant or, some other sort of payment from DHHS or another state agency using the RFP process, it's my belief that there's a provision in that process that says that, certain parts of that process can be confidential. We've also separately determined that the council does not need to go through, the council's grant making process is not governed by the state's RFP process. Furthermore, the council's work is very clearly governed by FOA, and the council has a clear requirement to do everything that it does publicly and transparently. Because there's no statute that says the council's grant making can be done in confidence. Therefore, as a result, everything the council does has to be done in public. So I, wrote this provision well before we learned all these nuances about the state's RFP process and how it relates to the council's grant making. So I agree with you that provision in the bylaws does not reflect the statute. But the statute says, as you had it up earlier in section 6, delineates only those things that can be done in executive session. So in order for the council to do any work in executive session, it has to find the activity listed under section 6 of that statute, and ask the cite to it as part of its motion to go into executive session.
So Brendan, the thought was that one of the thoughts that we had was that a group of people could meet, go over the scores of the grant applications in private, and then come in a public meeting to make recommendations to the council. So the group of people would be council members, and come to the council meeting that's public and make recommendations on who we fund and who we do not fund. But it doesn't seem that that would be allowed under FOA.
I don't see a provision under section 6 of the executive session part of FOA that would cover that. So I don't read the executive session statute to include that kind of activity. And as we've talked about before, in terms of public meetings, council members meeting outside of a public meeting would need to be public and would not, I don't read FOA as being able to permit that kind of group to meet outside of the public view.
Okay. We'll end here really quickly because we're over time and people are leaving, but I wouldn't mind hearing from Holly or Tess, because I think both of you have a lot more experience in this area than I do.
I don't know, Tess isn't here. FOA specifically?
Or how
Or the state
if
art?
you've been involved with like grant applications and grant review
Yes.
that would have to have FOA apply to, how have you managed that?
So, I mean, in my professional life now outside the legislature, I work for 2 nonprofits and I do grants, and there has never been an issue. When I worked for the state, there's always been this unspoken thing about FOA requests and grants, state RFP, is that the ones that are most likely to always be forward are the paving contracts. That's really interesting. For some reason, everybody wants to see. So once an award is made, everything leading up to that process, you're correct, is confidential. When you're assigned to a grant review committee, you're not allowed to talk about the different proposals, outside of whoever's been assigned to that committee. You don't talk about them outside. Share information with your other coworkers about them. If there's a question in the proposal, I think you can go back to, it is the provider's one shot at giving you their stuff. You can't go back and call a provider and say, gee, I thought on page 4, this looked kind of like you forgot something. And I wonder if you want to fill that in for me. You can't do that. You can't. It's done. Once that has been delivered to state procurement, that part's done. So you can't go outside and talk about that either. Once the decisions have been made, the scoring's been done, the recommendation goes forward, fund this one, fund agency A. All the other agencies have the right, once the award has been done, once the negotiation begins on the final, once that decision is made, the other agencies can come back and they can forward to see the proposals. Oftentimes, in my experience, people would do that because they want us to see what, that guy did that was better than all the other proposals, really to help influence how they will write future proposals. Less so Although there are elements where there have been. I've been awarded grants where people have filed lawsuits over how the awards got made or what the score was. It doesn't mean your project doesn't go forward. It means it ties it up a little bit on the side. But people have a right, once the decision is made, the award is made, to file those forward requests. It doesn't hold up the rest of the process, though. So agency A, if I got the award, I still go forward and do my initiative. Whatever the initiative was I said I would do for you, I'll still go forward and do it. And in the event the court, once this gets, administrative hearing and a decision's made, oh yeah, everybody on the awards committee was Holly's cousin, and she paid them to vote for her proposal, then there could be an overturning. But I other than that, I have never seen an overturning of a awards committee decision. And maybe Tessa, you have something different to add, but that was just my experience. But it is very confidential. You don't finish the process and go in the coffee room and talk about, oh yeah, agency X, Y, and Z came in. Boy, that was a disaster. You just don't do it. It's just sort of an ethical issue.
But Holly, when you're making the decision, is that open? Is that in an open meeting?
Just between the awards committee members. I think if they had if there was something really outrageous, like for instance,
So
how you learned that agency X, Y, and Z had lost their 501(c)(3) status. They had failed to file the past 3 years of their 990, and they no longer were recognized as a not-for-profit, but they hadn't told you that, and you're awarding grants to nonprofits. That would be a big deal, right? That would come up in the process internally to whatever department is in these reviews.
But Holly, when we were reviewing grants, we
Mhm.
got the scoring. And then when we were making the decisions based on the scoring, that was in a public meeting. And it doesn't sound like when you're doing that in the legislature, that that's in a public meeting.
I'm not speaking of the legislature right now. Before I ever was in the legislature, I worked in state government for 25 years.
Yeah.
I worked in the department. So I'm talking about, and before that, I actually applied for state grants and got them. So I'm just, and back then, wasn't as big a deal as it is now. Now it sounds to me from, being in the legislature that almost every state department is getting forward for everything now, which is creating so much busyness work. I don't, without asking the attorney general, I think the idea of opening up bids and having public hearings is a legal question that I would defer back to the AG's office to say, is this done in confidence? These applications, are they confidential materials until the awards are made? And should the review of those proposals be done in a public forum, or should those be done privately by the council? And once the decisions and the scoring's made, then that becomes public information. I think this is really a legal question that I would feel more comfortable getting an answer from the AG's office about. When is that public, and when does it lose being a privately submitted proposal and become a public proposal?
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Tess, do you have any comments?
I apologies. My dog just had surgery, so I was on the phone with the vet. So I don't want to comment without being able to fully hear everything and discuss. But from the limited knowledge of what I've heard so far, I think Paul, I had that question too. It kind of came up at our last council meeting of how do you have those deliberations if there's maybe certain things that would be said in a public forum that could end up being degrading towards the grantee, or certain pieces of information that would be almost, I don't know the legal word, but just something where counselors feel like they can't really weigh in honestly about an applicant, or there's things that they know that they don't want to say that's in a public forum and could embarrass the people.
Yeah. All right. Well,
Let me just add one or two more things. One, just briefly, one is on, Holly's description of the process. So I've not represented agencies about it at all, or about their RFP process. So, Holly knows a lot more about this than I do. But my recollection of various trainings that I went through is that after the award is made, uh, you know, uh, uh, you know, someone who didn't get the bid can FOA, what happened. And that, to address your question, Paul, about like, what about all the discussions of the panel that reviewed the application? I think one of the things you can obtain through the FOA process, I could be mistaken about this, is like the reviewer's notes, of kind of how they scored the application and whatever notes they kept about it. At some point, there's a I forget the legal term, but there's sort of a consolidation of those notes or those scores, and that consolidation sort of overrules the individual scores, but you can still get them both after the process is complete. But that's sort of it's a person filing a FOA request can get those, rather than like, I'm not saying the department makes it publicly available on its website, I think. But again, I would need to do a little more digging to figure that out. And then, on the point about like, to Tessa's point about, what if I know something during a grant making process? And the council's process right now is it had 3 reviewers. They make a, score, and then the council as a whole decides based on, with those scores as information, whether or not to award a grant. And, a council member if the council member is a scorer, they can, I think, incorporate their personal knowledge as part of that review process, but I'm not sure about that because I didn't conduct reviews myself. Also, for council members who weren't part of that 3-person scoring team, those council members have the ability to, if they don't want to say out loud what their concern is with a particular grantee, they can always vote against that grant. And sometimes that can signal to other, if council members know that a particular council member has like a lot of knowledge about that particular area or that grantee, that can signal to other council members that there's something that they want to dig into a little bit more about. So there are ways in which the council's actions, can accommodate those kinds of things without needing to go into detail about something. But it's true that the council doesn't currently have a procedure in which it can confidentially discuss among themselves concerns that a council member has about a potential grantee. Like, it all has to be done in public.
Okay, thank you, Brendan. I think we'll stop here because we're 15 minutes over.
Sorry, I'm talking too much.
No, that's not, no, I think it was an important discussion. I appreciate hearing Holly's experience too. So we'll get off now, and we'll have, I think I'll just present that to the council, to the Recovery Council, and we'll just put the ball in their court, that they'll have, that we've discussed it, and this is this is what the FOA statutes say. All right. Any last comments or questions?
I want to say good luck with your dog, Tess.
Yeah.
Thank you. She's home and snoring. You might have heard that while I was off mic. So Brendan, I'm right there with you with the pets making a
Good luck, Tess.
Goodbye. Good to see
Thanks.
everyone.
Bye.